Welcome everybody to this wildlife photography video, and firstly I just want to say thank you to everyone who wished me well. I really do appreciate that. Now today's video is all about the highlights in your photography, and the question I'm going to ask is it ever okay to blow out the highlights in your images? No, definitely not. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time. I am joking of course, please don't switch off the video yet, it will completely ruin my audience retention. I'm going to recap briefly. I have made videos on exposing for the highlights. I'll put a link on the screen, I'll try and put a link in the description box as well. But basically what we want to do with the lighter areas, particularly any white areas on wildlife subjects in your photographs, you want to try and make sure that you retain the detail in those areas. What we want to do is adjust the exposure to try and make sure that we don't overexpose or blow out those highlights and retain the detail. But the main question here is, do you always have to do that? Is this a rule that's written in stone? Now, some people might give you a blanket answer for this, that you should just never ever blow out the highlights. I don't think it's that simple. So obviously this is my opinion. Some people are going to agree, some people are probably going to disagree, and some people may be going to sit somewhere in the middle, and that's absolutely fine. I think there's a lot of different scenarios when it comes to this. So I really think it depends on the situation, and also to some extent how you want your picture to look, and a little bit of artistic license, creativity as well. So this is going to be really my approach and how I tend to do things. And the first thing to look at is where we have a subject that's very light or completely white. And a great example of this would be a mute swan. So I've got I've got an image here of a swan taking an absolutely gorgeous light. And the thing here is that all the feather detail is white. Obviously apart from the beak, around the beak area, everything is white. So here it's really important to me to make sure that I don't overexpose anything. So I'm going to look at this situation and take a lot of care over the exposure to ensure that I don't have any chance of blowing out the highlights to retain the detail. So I use the histogram to do that, and what I'll be looking for is to make sure that there's nothing off the end of the graph. So in this situation I do think it's really important that you pay attention to the exposure and you make a real effort not to overexpose and blow out the highlights. Now, what about if the subject is not completely white? What if there's some white in there? What should you do? This is often the case with some animals, and particularly wildfowl. They seem to have a lot of whites on them at times. What I'd say here is that area is probably something where you still want to avoid overexposing, try and make sure that you keep the detail. So in this example of a great crested grebe, whilst the back of the bird is largely grey, there is a lot of white on the neck, and there's feather detail in there. So to me, it's still important to try and maintain that. You can see this image here, it's flashing, overexposed. That means that I haven't done that, so I didn't get my exposure correct. So in this situation, I really should be trying to make sure that I don't overexpose those whites to retain the detail. And here is another example of a beautiful red squirrel, and of course this animal is famous, well, for being cute, but also for having a beautiful red coat. But they do have really smart white belly and chest underneath, and in this situation where it's standing up, it's really got that on show, so I don't want to lose the detail in there. So again here, I was really trying to make sure I underexposed a bit to retain the detail in that white area. Sometimes, however, you're going to find that there is a little bit of white, or there's a few white patches on the bird or the animal, the insect, and what do you need to do here? This is something I found quite interesting in the past. So I'm going to give an example here, which is a common kingfisher photographed in the UK. We do have whites, so the kingfisher will have a bit of a white patch on the face. Now in the past, I've actually been a little bit too obsessed with the whites. In my opinion, I've been too obsessed with the highlights and making sure that you don't blow them out at any time. But in this situation, I don't really think like that now. So I think that here with the kingfisher, the majority of the bird is not white. The only white bit is very small. So in my opinion, it's okay to blow it out probably completely. The thing is here, if you try and expose for those tiny white areas, and I know I've done it and I know that some of you have probably done this, if you try and expose for those areas, you make the image so dark that everything else becomes so dark and the rest of the plumage becomes so underexposed that it just doesn't look really very good, and then potentially you've got to try and bring it back in your photo editing program, and that can cause more degradation and you get into more problems. So what I tend to do here in this situation, if this amount of white on the subject, then I'll really push it, or these days I'll probably just blow it out entirely. I would say the lighting has an effect as well when it comes to highlights, and particularly if you're shooting into the light. So if you're shooting directly into the light, you know, going for that kind of strong rim lighting effect, then are the highlights as important? I would argue that they're not, and particularly if it's like that halo effect, like a really strong halo around the subject, then do you really get any detail in that kind of that outline? I would argue there that it's acceptable to actually blow out the highlights. So obviously this is going to be subjective again, but if you are shooting in these conditions, then just have a think about that, you know, whether you think it looks okay to blow out the highlights. And the benefit of doing that as well is that you're going to be able to work more on the detail in the shadow areas. In terms of your surroundings in your wildlife images, so if you've got a lot of habitat in there, some background, then this is one where I'm going to say, for me personally, I think it's absolutely fine to blow out the highlights. So there are going to be some situations where maybe it's not, maybe you've got some white flowers in there, you want to retain that detail. But if your background, for example, is quite light water or light blank sky that's part of your wildlife photograph, then I think it's absolutely fine to blow it out. And the reason for that is that it's not the most important part of your picture. Yes, it may show the habitat, but I think it's mostly important to concentrate on the subject in terms of exposure. So I think if you get that situation, just some background water, sky, then I think it's absolutely fine to blow out the highlights. There is something quite interesting in terms of the histogram if you're shooting RAW. Now, I mentioned earlier in the video that we want to use the histogram to make sure we don't blow out the highlights and make sure that the information doesn't go off the right hand side of the graph to retain the detail. Now, if you're shooting in RAW, when you look at the image on the back of the camera, on the screen and the histogram, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure this is the case, what you're actually looking at is a readout from a JPEG. You're not really looking at the raw data. So what this actually means is that there can be more information in the highlight areas in the RAW file that you just can't see. Now, the best way to check this always is just to try it and do it yourself, and that's what I've done. So I'm going to show you an example here, which is this lapwing in flight, which I've got some really fantastic images of. My best flight shots of lapwings ever. You can see there's just a little bit of flashing on this image on this RAW file, and it's showing that there's more information off the end of the graph, which basically says that the whites are blown out. So you would think that those whites are completely gone and there's nothing that you can do about it. In reality, that wasn't the case. So when I actually brought it into Lightroom, you can now see that there is more information there. So at the end of the histogram, there's a tiny little bit of a gap there, and I can even bring it back, underexpose it more to show there's definitely quite a gap. So basically, you can find sometimes that if you're shooting RAW, you might be able to tweak the image a little bit by just blowing out the highlights slightly, and you'll find that they're actually still there in post-processing, and you can work with them. Bear in mind though, this is only in RAW, and I'm pretty sure if you tried to do this in JPEG that you wouldn't be able to recover the data in the same way. So my general advice here would be, if you're photographing something that's completely white, then try to make sure you don't blow out the highlights to retain the detail. But if you're photographing maybe more into the light, and if you're confident enough that you think you can bring back the highlights in post-processing, then maybe consider blowing out the highlights to some extent. So what do you think? Let me know if any of this makes sense to you, how you approach your photography in terms of exposing for the highlights, maybe in different situations. Let me know in the comments box below. If you're not subscribed, do subscribe to this channel for more photography tutorials and vlogs. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.